Coming up, disappointment, the great conversation, and bullets for real. Welcome to Living Lafayette. For the Lafayette Alliance here in LaGrange, Georgia, I'm Richard Ingram. Lafayette and his caravan took 31 days to walk from Charleston to Philadelphia. Battling heat, mosquitoes the size of drones, they arrived on Sunday, July 27, 1777. It was the Sabbath. It is interesting that the population of the 13 colonies at the time was 2.5 million. In Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress met. Of those 2.5 million, 40,000 were in Philadelphia. It's interesting that the largest football stadium in the United States, Michigan Stadium, Ann Arbor, holds 108,000 people. LSU, Alabama, Tennessee, 102,000. Georgia, Auburn, Florida, 90,000. Any one of those stadiums could have comfortably held two Philadelphias. Lafayette and his colleagues needed to get their commissions, provided by Silas Deane, certified by the Continental Congress. At first, the Continental Congress, they were pleased to see these French officers applying for commissions in the Continental Army, but then the trickle became a flood. And there was this thing about character. It was many times missing. These French officers many times were bankrupt. They wanted high rank. They wanted high salary, pensions. Lafayette was familiar with some of these pretenders. He had met them down in Charleston. And he talked about them as riffraff and adventurers. True, Benjamin Franklin had sent 4 engineers who were top-notch. But then there was the case of Philippe Ducoudray. Ducoudray was an artillery officer. Silas Deane recruited him, made him a major general, put him in charge of artillery and engineering in the Continental Army. Well, Ducoudray was arrogant. He thought highly of himself and didn't mind your knowing that. There were several officers who had time in grade, and they took offense at being subordinated to Ducoudray. Generals Nathaniel Greene, General John Sullivan, and especially Henry Knox, and they threatened to resign. Congress felt obligated to give Ducoudray some position, so they made him Inspector General of Ordnance and Military Manufactories. Well, Ducoudray couldn't get along with anybody. He couldn't get along with Washington's chief engineer, Colonel Louis Deportes, who could get along with anybody. And Ducoudray had nothing good to say about the fortifications that were defending Philadelphia along the Delaware, which Washington had had a hand in. Fort Billingsport, down south, where Paulsboro, New Jersey is now, Washington had assigned Thaddeus Kosciuszko to design that fort. Well, Ducoudray just dismissed it out of hand. Further upstream, closer to Philadelphia, over on the Pennsylvania side, was Fort Mifflin. Washington thought Fort Mifflin needed to be beefed up. Ducoudray thought Fort Mercer was right across the Delaware River, where the Schuylkill intersects the Delaware, and right across on the Jersey side at Red Bank. There's Fort Mercer. Ducoudray thought Fort Mercer needed to be beefed up. Ducoudray challenged Washington. Well, Washington won that face-off. But nonetheless, Ducoudray continued to lobby Congress. He was very vocal about it, very cavalier about it. He lobbied Congress to beef up Fort Mercer. Here is someone, Dale Carnegie couldn't have how to win friends and influence people, Duke Dre wouldn't have understood it. There are some people who are that way, and you point out to them the error of that arrogance, and they don't understand what you're talking about. Duke Dre was one of those people. On September the 11th, 1777, Duke Dre was crossing a pontoon bridge across the Schuylkill River. His horse bolted. Both of them fell into the river. Both drowned. Duke Dre was buried in St. Mary's Church Cemetery. Nobody knows exactly where the plot is. But most people lamented the loss of a good horse. Congress was also wary of Baron de Kalb and Vicomte de Monroy. Silas Deane had stunned Congress with a letter. Deane had sent the letter December the 6th, 1777. Just a day before, he had given Lafayette his commission as a Major General on December 7th, of 1776 specifically. That letter, Silas Deane suggested that the Continental Congress replace the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, with a French officer, Victor Francois the Comte de Broye. This was the so-called de Broye intrigue. Baron de Kalb supported that idea. Vicomte de Monroy supported that idea, and Congress was aware of that. De Kalb had no idea about the recoil from that suggestion. Lafayette knew nothing of this intrigue, incidentally. Congress, in fact, now established a committee on foreign applications because it saw all these foreign officers applying for commissions through the veil, through that filter of Duke Dre, of de Kalb, of Monroy. The chair of that committee on foreign applications was James Lovell. He was from Massachusetts. He spoke fluent French. He disliked Frenchmen, and he hated Silas Deane. So Lafayette and his crew arrived in Philadelphia on Sunday, July 27, 1777. It was the Sabbath. Nothing was open. They went straight away to John Hancock's home. John Hancock, this was the same one that signed the Declaration of Independence, very flowery signature, such that George III could see it. John Hancock was president of the Second Continental Congress. There had been 14 total presidents of the Continental Congress. The first was from Virginia, the second, Henry Middleton, who lasted only 4 days, from South Carolina, the third from Virginia, and then John Hancock from Massachusetts. Lafayette showed Hancock his letters of introduction. Hancock sort of rifled through them. And then Hancock sent them to Robert Morris's home. Morris was a member of the Committee on Secret Correspondence. So this group trudged over to Robert Morris's home, gave Morris letters of introduction. Morris rifled through them. There was one letter from Silas Deane to Robert Morris specifically, informing Morris about this aristocrat, Lafayette, who was very wealthy, and would Morris be his banker? Well, that caught Morris's attention. So Morris suggested that that group meet him the next day, be Monday, in front of the State House, the Pennsylvania State House. That would later become Independence Hall. They're on Chestnut Street. So the following morning, Lafayette, Baron de Kalb, Vicomte de Monroy, Valfort, Delisle, Gimont, and Dubuisson, and 6 others. There were 13 of them. They met there on Chestnut Street in front of the State House. This is where Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress met. The First Continental Congress met right down the street at Carpenter's Hall. Lafayette expected to see Morris and a cordial welcome. He waited and waited. Finally, Morris came out of the State House, and striding beside him was none other than James Lovell. Morris introduced Lovell, told Lafayette and crew, Lovell will take care of your needs, wheeled about, gone, back in the State House. James Lovell then proceeded to harangue Lafayette and Company. You are greedy, you are adventurers, you want high rank, high salary, high pension. And don't get me started on Ducoudray, he said. And Silas Deane overstepped his authority. Lafayette sort of handed over his letters of introduction about this time, and Lovell sort of rifled through them again, really not paying them any mind. And then Lovell completed his harangue saying, "Go back to France," wheeled around back in the State House. Lafayette was stunned, but he hadn't come this far to give up. And Lafayette was familiar with Ducoudray. He'd gotten a disparaging letter from Ducoudray at one time. And Lafayette had also heard of Thomas Conway. Conway was an Irishman. His family had immigrated to France, and then Conway had become a colonel in the French army. Silas Deane had recruited him, made him a brigadier general in the Continental Army. And Conway's men hated him. He was arrogant, he was superior. So Lafayette had an idea about the source of the antipathy that Congress had for these French officers. Meanwhile, the Committee on Foreign Applications, James Lovell, they looked at Lafayette's letters of introductions in earnest. So there was a letter from Silas Deane to Robert Morris, very complimentary to Lafayette. From Silas Deane to John Hancock, likewise. And then from William Carmichael, who was from Maryland, and Carmichael was Silas Deane's secretary. Well, William Carmichael had written a letter to Tench Tillman. Tillman was a fellow Marylander and also an aide-de-camp to Washington. And Carmichael, you remember, had had several conversations with Lafayette, knew Lafayette well, and spoke highly of Lafayette. And Carmichael also sent a letter to Richard Henry Lee, who was a member of Congress from Virginia, again, extolling Lafayette. Lovell decided that maybe he had been a little rash in his initial impressions. So Lovell, fearing, rightfully, that he may have made a bad impression on Lafayette, buttonholed William Duer, who was from New York, a congressman from New York, also spoke fluent French. And the two of them went out and pulled Lafayette aside. They had two meetings subsequently with Lafayette. They wanted to determine exactly what Lafayette's intentions were. Lafayette told them that he was of a different stripe than Ducoudray. True, he wanted high rank, wanted to be Major General. True, he had decided he wanted to serve under George Washington. But he would serve without pay and without command. Duer, who took the lead, was satisfied. But he did ask Lafayette whether he would agree to having his commission dated that day, which was Thursday, July 31st, as opposed to December the 7th, 1776, when Silas Deane granted the commission. And the reason for that was that if they dated it back in December, that means that Lafayette would have time and grade over American officers who'd already been serving. So it could cause some difficulty. That was not a problem for Lafayette. We'll date it today. Works out fine. Duer then asked Lafayette to write out those bullet points of what we agreed. Lafayette did that. Duer took it back to the Committee on Foreign Applications within 2 hours. Duer was back, commission certified. Lafayette was Major General and presumably also brought his sash. For a Major General, was usually light purple. Washington wore a light blue ribbed sash, although he dispensed with that later, saying it was too aristocratic. And Lafayette was informed that he could meet George Washington that evening at City Tavern. Washington was coming through Philadelphia to conference with the Continental Congress. The strategy of British forces and General William Howe was straight out of Julius Caesar. The idea was to quarantine New England. After all, New England, those were the renegades, those were the upstarts. If we could quarantine New England and then capture the middle colonies, that included Philadelphia, the South would take care of itself. There were a lot of loyalists, the thinking went. And if we can do that, quarantine New England, capture the middle colonies, it's over. So General John Burgoyne would come down from Quebec, and Brigadier Barry St. Leger would come down the Mohawk from Ontario, and William Howe, stationed at New York, would go up the Hudson, and they would all meet at Albany. That would quarantine New England. It would capture the middle colonies. Deed done. Except Barry St. Leger got stalled at the siege of Fort Stanwix, where Rome, New York is now. He turned back. And William Howe, inexplicably, loaded his men there at New York on board ships and headed south to Philadelphia. Whether there was miscommunication, disenchantment among the personalities, unclear. But it left John Burgoyne to make a decision. Did he forge on, or did he turn back? Well, Burgoyne decided that he would forge on. Continental Commander Horatio Gates would be the one who would intercept him. Washington was at Corrals Ferry, keeping an eye on William Howe and the main British contingent there at New York. Washington couldn't quite decide why Howe had loaded ship and was not going up the Hudson to meet Burgoyne. In any event, Washington sent General Benedict Arnold and Benjamin Lincoln and Colonel Daniel Morgan's riflemen. They were really developing a reputation as sharpshooters. He sent all of them up to Horatio Gates. And Washington sent a contingent of the Continental Army down to Chester, Pennsylvania, down south of Philadelphia. And then Washington that evening was going to meet Continental Congressmen at City Tavern. That evening at City Tavern, Lafayette was there. City Tavern's right at the intersection of Walnut and 2nd Streets. It's been there for a long time, and it was a meeting, a social gathering place for Continental Congressmen to meet and talk over affairs of state. Over the last many years, City Tavern's been owned by the National Park Service, and in 1994, it leased City Tavern to Chef Walter Stieb. There was a period menu. It was very nice, elegant. 2 years ago, it closed because of the pandemic, and the National Park Service now is looking for a new lessee. Lafayette said that there was no mistaking George Washington, that he was commanding and at the same time unassuming. After the meeting was complete, Washington met with Lafayette. Washington had been forewarned that Lafayette was going to be there by Benjamin Harrison, who was a congressman from Virginia. So Washington knew some of the details. Washington thanked Lafayette for his sacrifices, apologized for all the inconveniences, and suggested that Lafayette join him the next day for a review of fortifications around Philadelphia. Lafayette was delighted. The next morning, Lafayette went out. It was Friday morning. Lafayette went out and reviewed fortifications with Washington. Meanwhile, Baron de Kalb lobbied Congress to get his commission certified. De Kalb argued that he had signed on in good faith. He clearly had the experience, and he would accept whatever pay that the Continental Congress thought worthy. And, by the way, de Kalb said to Congress, Lafayette is a wonderful young man. He is deserving of whatever emoluments come to him. He's enthusiastic about the American cause. It was very complimentary. The next day, Saturday, Washington received official confirmation from Congress that Lafayette had been certified as a major general in the Continental Army. Lafayette at first thought about rejecting that certification. It would be a protest because his colleagues had not been similarly certified. But then John Hancock made an offhand comment to the effect that he, Hancock, thought that Lafayette's colleagues would be certified. And then about a week later, Washington, very dramatically, sent out a carriage and four to pick Lafayette up, to bring him to headquarters at Germantown to review troops. Lafayette was gone for about a week. When Lafayette arrived at Germantown, he saw 11,000 Continentals who were poorly clothed, poorly armed, and apparently Washington saw that reflected in Lafayette's face. Washington made a comment, "You must be disappointed coming from a French army that is well uniformed, well armed." To which Lafayette famously replied, "I come here to learn, not to teach." All of a sudden, Lafayette's social capital just spiked. Here was someone who was of a different stripe, someone humble. That attitude, and it rippled through the Continental Army. He was popular. His aide had gone with him, Jamal, and it was interesting that back in France, Lafayette had been taciturn, he had been quiet and reserved, and here he was friendly and enthusiastic. He was in his element. On August the 13th, 1777, Lafayette wrote his first letter in English. It was to the Continental Congress. He thanked them for his commission. He asked them to commission his colleagues likewise, and he asked for a command. Well, Congress was still stinging from Ducoudray and still suspicious of Baron de Kalb and the Vicomte de Monroy. But not so Lafayette. And Lafayette's reputation also improved when Count Pulaski came through Philadelphia. Pulaski from Poland came to offer his services to the Continental Army, and he came bearing letters, one from Adrian to Lafayette. It was the first that Lafayette had gotten since getting to America. But there was another from Silas Deane to Robert Morris, very complimentary to Lafayette. And more importantly, Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin to the Committee on Foreign Correspondence, extolling Lafayette and the value that he would have to the Continental Army. Benjamin Franklin's signature on this really carried weight. And Franklin also sent a personal letter to Washington, telling Washington about Lafayette and asking Washington to mentor Lafayette, to give him advice if needed, loans if needed. And Count Pulaski said he would be pleased to serve in the Continental Army, but only if he could serve under one of two commands, either the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, or Lafayette. All of a sudden, Lafayette's social capital spiked. Word got around. On August the 17th, Lafayette was in Philadelphia. On August 21st, he was back in camp with Washington. Sometime between those 2 days, Washington and Lafayette had what Louis Gottschalk called the Great Conversation. Washington was unsure about Lafayette's commission. Was it honorary? Was he to be given a command? So Washington queried Congress. Benjamin Harrison wrote him back saying it's honorary. He's not to be given a command. Washington took Lafayette aside, knowing that he'd be disappointed not getting a command. Washington told him, Congress did not intend that you'd get a command. There is no command here in your future. But I would be pleased, I would be privileged to be your father and your friend. Consider yourself part of my family. Washington often referred to his aides as his family. And maybe he was using this figuratively, but that's not how Lafayette took it. Lafayette took it very literally. Lafayette was delighted. He considers himself part of Washington's family, the Great Conversation. On August the 21st, Washington's Council of War met. They speculated that William Howe, his men loaded aboard those ships and sailing down the coast, was likely headed for Charleston as destination. The minutes were signed that day. So there was Washington, Commander-in-Chief, at the top of the minutes. Then the major generals. There was General Nathaniel Greene, William Alexander Lord Sterling, General Stephen, and there it was for the first time, Marquis de Lafayette, MG. And then the brigadier generals down below. There was Maxwell, Knox, Wayne, Muhlenberg. Oh, there was Scott, and there was Conway, but there was Lafayette for the first time. Well, so there was this question about what William Howe really intended. Howe did not go to Charleston. Howe came up Chesapeake Bay. Washington accordingly marched his troops through Philadelphia. Washington at the head of the column, Lafayette riding right beside him. They all had green sprigs up in their caps. On August the 25th, the Continental Army established itself at Quaker Hill in Wilmington, Delaware, where President Biden, I understand, has a home, and in nearby Newport, Delaware. Later that day, William Howe landed at Head of Elk, Maryland, and unloaded 18,000 British soldiers. Washington had 15,000, 3,000 of whom were indisposed. On September the 3rd, there was a skirmish at Christiana, Delaware. It's the first time Washington had been part of an army where real bullets were exchanged. On September the 6th, Lafayette's birthday, the men congregated at Newport, Delaware, in anticipation of a British attack. On September the 8th, the British made a feint as though they were going to attack, but they didn't, and Washington didn't jump offside. The Council of War met that day, and they confirmed Howe is headed for Philadelphia. Therefore, we should take the high ground some 26 miles southwest of Philadelphia. So on September the 9th, Washington established his headquarters at the Benjamin Ring House. Lafayette was a quarter-mile away at the Gideon Gilpin House. And the Continental Army aligned itself along Chad's Ford on the east bank of Brandywine Creek. On the morning of September 11th, the British attacked. The Battle of Brandywine. Bullets for real. This is Living Lafayette. To discover, to inform, to entertain. Till next time.